Hello. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the sea country on which we've done this work, the Wapabara, Naro, Gureng, Gurung, Bailey and Tarablang Bunda people. How do I do this? And yes, I am another Tanya. I work on rubble also. I'm a Brizzy local, and I guess I fell in love with the ocean through visiting Stradbroke Island, Manduraba, for family holidays. So I'm going to talk to you today about different components of the rubble stabilisation subprogram and how they can be used to improve intervention planning and deployment. So yeah, as Tanya's just said, reefs maybe have 6 to 9% rubble, but that number is potentially a big question mark. What we do know though is that corals are dying and dead corals make rubble. So yeah, bleaching events, cyclones all increasing in intensity and frequency. Other events such as COTS outbreaks and ship groundings as well, which are a lot more common on the GBR than you might think. They all generate coral rubble. And if this generated rubble hangs around long enough on reefs, that is like it's hanging around rather than being swept off somewhere, that's where it can create a problem. So yeah, loose rubble that's rolling around and killing coral recruits through that abrasion and burial. And so Suki in our lab and Pete did some estimations that around, depending what you call a rubble problem in terms of rubble cover, perhaps 20% of reefs likely develop a rubble problem on reefs, and that's due to their bathymetry, so they have these areas that can collect rubble. And then those rubble beds that are generated, as Tanya has said, they have different forms. So we've done some surveys at different locations, so inshore at Keppels and offshore at Heron, and in rubble beds in different exposures, different depths. We did a lot of measurements, so just a few of these, so rubble length, rubble bed thickness, and the binding. So rubble can get bound together by things like sponges, macroalgae, crustose coralline algae. They all work to glue, in some cases, glue the rubble together again into a stable substrate, which in theory is better for corals. So as Austin just pointed out, we can have rubble beds that might have very small pieces, unbranched pieces, quite thin rubble beds, and perhaps on sandy substrates. And these tend to be generally pretty unstable, so smaller unbranched pieces rolling around a lot. These rubble beds can be, like Tanya mentioned, persistent rubble beds, so the groove systems in like a spur and groove system, that would be a persistent rubble bed like this. So we don't really expect recovery in these areas because that's how they are geomorphologically. Other rubble beds that have better recovery prospects tend to have larger pieces, more branched pieces that are going to interlock better, which adds to the stability of that rubble bed. However, we also have to think about what is binding in that rubble bed and what's growing on the rubble. So in this case, so this is rubble beds in sheltered areas of Keppel, so we've got a lot of Lobophora growing over it, so that's acting to limit coral recovery in those areas. So the best recovery prospects for rubble beds tend to, again, have these larger branchy rubble that's interlocking, but the binders are more your sponges, Pacenalia, crustose coralline algae, etc. And we found that this was generally in areas, exposed areas and shallower areas. So that was a bit counterintuitive because you'd expect shallow areas to have more rubble movement. So as long as the rubble can interlock or imbricate in those exposed shallow areas, you can expect better recovery prospects. So yeah, in terms of physical factors, the rubble length and the rubble bed thickness are some of the most important drivers in terms of predicting recovery potential in the rubble bed. So we found that both these factors correlated well with the probability of binding, so that is the rubble is getting bound together into a stable substrate, which could be better or worse for corals depending on what those binders are. So bringing this back to interventions, so interventions depend on the substrate condition. So the things like larval seeding, coral seeding, they're all depending on having that substrate, a good substrate for coral survival and growth. And interventions are needed on degraded areas, which are commonly going to include rubble. And this might be an obscure reference, but oils ain't oils, or rubble beds ain't rubble beds. So there are different kinds, and we need to be treating them differently when it comes to interventions, because that's going to affect our chance of intervention success. So we really need to be understanding the substrate condition, is the bottom line. And just a few examples after chats with Kathy Page and Carly Randall. So they're working on the coral seeding devices. And in this kind of environment, so this is the Keppel's rubble beds, so those larger branched pieces, the coral seeding devices actually just sort of fell into the matrix. They've got different designs now where they're more of an arm where they sit on top of the rubble bed. So that would be better for the falling through the matrix, but then you've got the Lobophora. So yeah, a few problems going on. And then I've also had a chat with Taylor Whitman. So this is another kind of rubble bed, so smaller rubble, perhaps on a sandy substrate. And this was in Moor Reef. And here she also had some problems with the coral seeding devices, so they were struggling. This was also despite the fact that it looks like quite a good site, so it's little patches of rubble and lots of coral around it. And it's also despite the fact that she stabilised these coral seeding devices, so the stability component has been taken out of it. And that brings me to my next point, which is that mobility of rubble, so the fact that rubble is unstable, in some cases, is not the whole story. And so Roima is a PhD student in MCEL as well, and she has shown this. So she's looked at coral recruitment on stabilised rubble, so that's bits of rubble tied onto a metal grid, and she's put that into a loose rubble habitat, an interlocked rubble habitat, and hard carbonate, or a pavement area. And what she's found that even when that rubble is stable, so we've got a number of coral settlers on the y-axis here, that settlement is still lower in the loose rubble habitat, even though the rubble pieces themselves that the corals are settling on are stable. And then as you increase the stability of that surrounding habitat, the number of settlers is increasing as well. What is going on here? There's a lot of work to be done, but I think some of the main things are the sediment, so higher sediment deposition in a loose rubble environment, which is linked to the flow, so different flow conditions in a loose rubble versus interlocked versus hard carbonate. You might have lower small-scale flow going on around smaller rubble pieces, and also just the proximity to that sediment as well. Competition as well, there could be different organisms growing on rubble of different sizes and morphologies, which has been shown actually. So this is all at quite a fine resolution. So what about scaling up this? So what about predicting rubble condition on a broader scale? So we might want to determine whether a rubble bed is likely to recover on its own, or whether some sort of intervention is needed. So if an intervention is needed, do we need to stabilise? So do we need to go in and stabilise before larval seeding or coral seeding? To do that, we would want to make sure that movement is actually the issue there. Or is the rubble already pretty stable, like those rubble beds in the Keppels, and maybe we actually need to do something different, like go in and do algal removal before or something like that. So to try and provide these answers, this is in a very small nutshell, as well as the rubble surveys that we did of different rubble bed types. We've also looked at binding rates, so that's putting out stabilised bits of rubble similar to what I showed with Roma's experiment, and tracking what's growing on it and what's binding and gluing that rubble together over time, and how strong those binds are. I'm not going to go into detail too much with this plot, but all I want you to take away is that as the rubble is stable for longer, so as time is increasing, more things are growing on that rubble and they're becoming stronger. So that line is going up. There is some variation, obviously, around the exposure and depth, but I'm not going to talk about that too much today. But we've also looked at, as well as the binding rates, the mobilisation of rubble, so what flow speeds moves pieces of rubble. And then we're going to, or we are currently, putting those things together basically to, oh, the little rubble's moving, to answer the question, in a given environment, so in a given environment considering the hydrodynamic conditions, is the rubble going to be stable long enough to, for binding to occur? Oh, sorry. And is it also going to withstand breakage from that movement? So this is, so as an example, if you have rubble stable for a shorter period of time, you might have binding by macroalgae. Macroalgae is not as strong as a crustose coralline algae. Obviously, it's not a calcifier, unless it's halimeda. So that might break. If the rubble's stable for a longer period of time, then you might have more sponge coralline algae coming in, and that potentially could withstand breakage. So Fikri in our lab is working on this at the moment. So he's putting the work together from the binding surveys, the binding rates, and wave conditions. So from Dave Callahan's everyday wave condition wave models. He's putting that together and basically answering this question for every cell on the GBR to come up with a probability of binding in each of those cells. I was going to go into this, but I don't have time, so I put it in the background. So then, once we have an idea of, okay, where is rubble more or less likely to bind, and hence we have an idea about the recovery potential, what do we do about it? So stabilisation methods there have been categorised into sort of three main types. So direct manipulation of the substrate, so that could be actually removing the rubble completely. Addition of stabilisation structures, so things like rock piles or reef stars, and use of biological techniques. So this includes things like the bioglues, which Brett will be talking about tomorrow. So we got together a whole bunch of managers and practitioners and researchers, a lot who are here at the conference over these couple of days, and we had a talk about what works and what doesn't in terms of stabilisation methods, because there's really not a lot of published literature out there on it. And what will basically become of this workshop is two products. So the rubble stabilisation guidelines, Suki again has been working on that in our lab. So that's in a draft form at the moment, and we envision that as being sort of the Bible of rubble stabilisation. That will be a very practical tool that practitioners anywhere, not just in Australia but globally as well, can pick up and decide what stabilisation method they use on their patch of reef. The second product is Bayesian Belief Net, which is a tool that will give guidance on what method to use based on your environment and other factors. Okay, so just some quick takeaways. So bigger rubble pieces, more branched rubble pieces, and thicker rubble beds equals better recovery potential, but depending on the little sea cucumber, depending on what's binding and growing on it. And one thing that came out of the workshop is that interventions that stabilise rubble but also provide vertical relief. So in this picture, the stabilisation structure to the left is a grid which is just pinning down the rubble. The one on the right is also pinning down the rubble, but it's got that pyramid which is providing that vertical relief for corals. That can potentially give better success because it is lifting corals up out of that environment, which even if it is stable, we've seen that that could still cause some issues. And this is, the team. There's some members that aren't on the team any longer but have contributed significantly to this work. And I'm also highlighting Karen Eigeland, who is my research assistant, who I've spent many, many months in the field with over the past 3 years. And she is looking for work at the end of June. So if you need a research assistant, she's a very competent boater and diver. So yeah, let me know. Thank you.
Time for one quick question, if there is one.
Thanks, Tanya and Tanya. Great talks. What do you think is the role of bioerosion in the whole story of rubble stabilisation? You talked a lot about consolidation and rubble sizes, and obviously water quality is a key factor in breaking down rubble through boring sponges.
Yeah, I would say also those, probably the rubble beds that, like the ones at the Keppels, that are potentially stable, but they've got that overgrowth of algae, they're probably going to be the ones that are more bio-eroded as well. So yeah, actually that's a good point, that even though they might seem stable, because of that bio-erosion, it's even a worse story than expected. Whereas, yeah, in those exposed shallow environments, that growth of crustose coralline algae seems to sort of exceed that of bio-erosion in that case. So yeah, I guess it's another factor that's sort of adding onto the story and pulling in extreme ends. Yeah, good question.
Thanks very much, Tanya.
Thank you.